Most people think the emotional break in money happens at $1 million. They imagine some dramatic moment where the account finally looks large enough to impress strangers, where the fear disappears, where every purchase feels easy, where life suddenly opens and says you have arrived. That is not how I have seen it work. The first real break usually comes much earlier, and it is much less glamorous than people think. It does not arrive with applause. It does not make you look rich. It does not even change your life on the surface in a way other people can immediately see. What it changes first is your mind. If I had to name the number that begins that change for many ordinary people, I would tell you it is $20,000. Not because $20,000 makes you wealthy. Not because $20,000 guarantees success. Not because $20,000 solves every... For many people, that is the level where money stops being only a source of pressure and starts becoming a source of choice. That is a very different thing. I have spent my life around capital, around businesses, around markets, around human behavior, and one lesson shows up again and again. The size of a person's future is often determined less by the size of their ambition than by the quality of the decisions they are able to make when they are not cornered. A man with no room is not really deciding, he is reacting. A woman who cannot absorb a setback is not planning. She is improvising under stress. A family with no cushion is not allocating capital. They are trying to survive the next surprise. That is why the beginning of wealth is so often misunderstood. People think the story starts with exotic investments, unusual intelligence, special access, or secret strategies. Most of the time it starts somewhere more basic. It starts when the panic begins to recede. Before that point, almost every money decision gets filtered through urgency. Can I make rent? Can I cover the repair? Can I say no to this expense? Can I survive if my hours get cut? Can I take a better job if it pays me later? Can I wait one more week? Can I absorb one more mistake? That is not a good environment for long-term thinking. It is not a good environment for patience, discernment, or intelligent risk-taking. It is the financial equivalent of trying to read a map while the car is already sliding on ice. People in that state are often judged unfairly. Others call them undisciplined, short-sighted, emotional, weak with money. I think that is too easy. Scarcity changes behavior. It narrows the field of vision. It turns every small cost into a potential threat. It makes long-term trade-offs feel abstract and immediate pain feel enormous. A person in that condition can know all the right principles and still be unable to use them well. That is why I take the $20,000 threshold seriously. It is not a trophy number. It is not some magical law of the universe. It is a practical line. For many people, it represents enough cash and enough investing momentum to stop asking. Every day, whether one bad week will throw the whole machine off the table. And when that question starts disappearing, something powerful happens. The mind gets quieter, the decisions get cleaner, the time horizon begins to lengthen. You stop thinking only about what you owe this month and begin thinking about what you can own 10 years from now. I have watched people spend years trying to improve their finances while still living in constant reaction. They read the books, they listen to the podcasts, they open the brokerage account. They promise themselves this will be the year they get serious. Then a dental bill lands, a transmission fails, a child needs something, a rent increase arrives, hours get cut, a job becomes unbearable. The whole plan falls apart because there was never enough shock absorption built into the system. That is not really a plan failing. That is fragility revealing itself. The first $20,000 changes that fragility more than people expect. Research has pointed in the same direction. Vanguard has shown that even a relatively small emergency reserve improves financial well-being in a meaningful way. With only a couple $1,000s set aside, the pressure already begins to lift. Move from that to a buffer closer to several months of living expenses, and the psychological relief becomes more substantial. The exact percentage points are not the heart of the lesson. The heart of the lesson is that money does not merely buy things, it buys room, and room changes behavior. Fay Filocyte, Fay Turn 12 File 0 Fay, that room matters more than luxury in the early years. When you are operating with no reserve, the first acceptable job offer feels like the only job offer. The first apartment you can barely afford feels like the place you must accept. The first deal with monthly payments low enough to squeeze through feels reasonable because you are always measuring from the bottom. You are not choosing among good alternatives. You are choosing among immediate constraints. Once you hold a real cushion, even if the number is still modest by Wall Street standards, the whole negotiation changes. Now you can wait. Now you can compare, now you can say no, now you can leave, now you can ask a different question, not how do I get through the month, but what arrangement gives me the best odds over the next decade. That is a life-changing question. A great many people never ask it because they never get the breathing room required to ask it, honestly. That is why I say $20,000 is not about image. It is about leverage over your own behavior. If you start at zero and save $1,000 a month while earning an 8% return, the first stretch feels painfully slow. It can take roughly 19 months to build that first 20,000. 19 months is long enough for most people to get impatient, bored, distracted, or discouraged. It is long enough for temptation to feel justified. It is long enough to make the entire project seem unfair. You can work hard for a year and a half and still feel as though the finish line has barely moved. That slowness is exactly why the milestone matters. It proves something deeper than arithmetic. It proves continuity. It proves restraint. It proves that you can build a structure before the structure begins paying you back. And then, after that first threshold, the logic starts to change. The next 20,000 can come faster, not because you suddenly became wiser, but because your capital is now pulling with you. The same monthly contribution that once had to do almost all the lifting now gets help from the money already in motion. The second climb can shrink. Then the third, then the process that once felt like hand-to-hand combat begins to feel like a machine. That is compound interest in its most misunderstood form. People talk about compounding as if it were merely a formula on a spreadsheet. It is more than that. It is a transition in the character of effort. In the beginning, almost everything comes from sacrifice. Later, more and more comes from position. The first stage asks, can you save? The next stage asks, can you continue? The later stage rewards you because the earlier stage was not interrupted. That is why the first meaningful reserve matters so much. It begins the shift from labor, only progress to labor plus capital progress. I think people underestimate how important that is emotionally. If you invest $9,000 and it rises 10%, you make $100. That is mathematically sound and psychologically weak. It does not feel powerful. It does not change your identity. It does not persuade you that the system is working. If you put $20,000 to work and earn the same 10%, now the gain is $2,000. Suddenly the same principle feels real. The same market return that once looked trivial now looks like something with weight. Nothing about the method changed. The scale changed, and scale transforms your relationship to the result. That is why small early wins can feel so unimpressive. The process is valid long before it feels meaningful. Many people quit in that gap. They want emotional proof too soon. They want visible acceleration before enough capital exists to create it. They stand over a seedling and complain that it is not yet an orchard. You do not build financial power by demanding that the first season look like the 10th. You build it by surviving the first season. When a person reaches $20,000, another shift begins that has nothing to do with markets and everything to do with identity. To save that amount from ordinary income, most people must become someone different. They must track money with more honesty than before. They must delay purchases that once felt automatic. They must resist the constant pressure to treat every hard week as an excuse for relief spending. They must stop interpreting every raise as permission to raise their lifestyle. They must get comfortable with invisible progress. That last one is particularly important. Invisible progress is where most wealth is built. Nobody claps because you kept the old car another year. Nobody notices because you said no to the larger apartment. Nobody gives you a medal because you sent the money to savings before it hit your checking account. Nobody congratulates you because you stayed boring while other people looked flashy. But your balance sheet notices, your future notices, your options notice, and one day your nervous system notices. That is the hidden victory in the first real reserve. You are no longer merely someone who wants financial security. You have evidence that you can behave in a way that produces it. That evidence is worth far more than motivational talk. It changes the tone of every decision that follows. When you have no savings, a $4 purchase can trigger a ridiculous amount of internal debate. It is not really about the $4. It is about the fact that the margin is gone. When every dollar feels recruited for emergency duty, nothing is emotionally small. Once you have a foundation, that tension eases. You do not become careless. You become more rational. You stop burning mental energy on tiny expenses and begin concentrating on the large forces that actually shape financial outcomes. Where do I live? How much of my income do I keep? What kind of car obligation am I carrying? What do I own? What do I owe? How exposed am I to job loss? How fast am I converting earnings into assets? Those are the questions that move the needle. The person stuck in scarcity obsesses over coffee. The person with a foundation pays attention to housing, transportation, taxes, debt structure, and investment behavior. That is not because the second person is smarter. It is because they can finally afford to focus on what matters. This is one of the great ironies in personal finance. The less room people have, the more likely they are to spend attention on the least important variables. Not because they are foolish, but because pressure drags the eye toward whatever is immediate. Once room appears, strategy becomes possible. And strategy is where wealth begins to separate itself from income. I have often said that temperament matters more than raw intellect in investing. The same principle applies to personal money. The most valuable thing a reserve gives you is not merely a higher account balance. It gives you better emotional conditions in which to exercise judgment that affects work. It affects career decisions more than many people realize. A worker living paycheck to paycheck is negotiating from weakness whether he admits it or not. He may have talent, he may have experience, he may even know he is underpaid, but if losing the job would produce immediate distress, then the employer is operating against a person whose fallback is too thin. That person is less likely to ask for the raise, less likely to refuse a bad arrangement, less likely to look elsewhere, less likely to take a temporary step backward for a long-term step forward, less likely to challenge unreasonable behavior, less likely to protect his own time. He needs the next check too much. That need leaks through even when he tries to hide it. Once you have enough money set aside to survive for a while, the posture changes. You stand differently, you speak differently, you ask questions you once avoided. You consider paths that previously felt irresponsible. In some cases, you do not even have to use the money. The mere existence of the reserve changes your confidence. You stop negotiating like a hostage and start negotiating like a participant with alternatives. That is enormously valuable. It can change income faster than people expect because confidence alters behavior, and altered behavior changes opportunity. A person with walking away money, even if it is only enough for several months, is often more effective than a person earning slightly more but living with nothing behind him. Freedom is not the same as income. Many people learn that too late. I have watched people with respectable salaries remain trapped because their expense structure consumed every gain they made. They looked prosperous from the road, but every dollar was already promised. They were not rich. They were tightly financed. That is why I pay so much attention to burn rate. A large income with a large burn rate creates dependency. A moderate income with a disciplined burn rate can create options. Over time, create wealth. And wealth, properly handled, creates independence. The engine begins with surplus. $20,000 matters because it is large enough for many people to demonstrate that surplus is no longer theoretical. Now you can start doing something more important than enduring. You can start allocating. That word may sound dry, but it governs financial life. Every dollar either protects you, consumes you, compounds for you, or leaks away without improving your future. Most households do not fail because they never earned enough to matter. They fail because they never built enough structure to keep money moving toward ownership. The first reserve is the first visible proof that the direction is changing. At that point, another subtle transformation occurs. Unexpected expenses no longer feel like moral failures. The car repair is annoying, but it is not an emergency. The medical bill is inconvenient, but it does not erase the month. The broken laptop is a problem, not a catastrophe. That distinction sounds small until you have lived both ways. Catastrophe thinking is exhausting. It degrades decision quality. It teaches people to grab immediate relief at long-term cost. It pushes them toward high-interest debt, rushed choices, and psychological fatigue. A reserve interrupts that pattern. It returns ordinary problems to their proper size. And once ordinary problems shrink, opportunities become easier to see. This is another reason money appears to attract more money. It is not because the universe plays favorites. It is because capital widens the menu of choices. The person with no reserve must ignore many possibilities, not because they are foolish, but because they are unavailable. The person with a reserve can evaluate them. A career move requiring a few months of patience, a professional credential that costs cash up front, a conference that improves future earnings, a small business idea that needs seed capital, an investment opportunity that appears during a panic, a move to a more efficient city, a temporary gap between one role and a better one. All of those choices are easier when you have liquidity. Liquidity is not just about solvency. It is about the ability to act when timing matters in investing. That matters enormously. The market occasionally offers good businesses at more sensible prices, but these opportunities often show up during moments when people without reserves are least able to take advantage of them. If your household is always one surprise away from stress, then volatility is merely another threat. If you have a cushion, volatility can become a source of selective opportunity. That shift is one of the hidden dividing lines between people who always feel hunted by money and people who gradually begin to use money as a tool. I want to say something here that a lot of people resist. The first $20,000 is not there to make you feel rewarded for your discipline. It is there to become the base from which your future compounds. That means the milestone is fragile, and many people damage it the moment they reach it. They finally save real cash. They feel proud. They feel deprived by the months or years it took. Then they decide they deserve a large purchase, a nicer car, a trip, a new apartment, a symbolic upgrade to prove to themselves that all this effort meant something. That is a dangerous moment, because the mind starts translating a foundation into permission. The reserve gets interpreted as excess. What should have been treated as strategic strength gets treated as available lifestyle fuel. I would urge almost anyone in that stage to resist that impulse. The first real reserve is not a finish line. It is the first piece of scaffolding. You do not tear down the scaffolding because you are excited that the building has started to rise. You protect it. You build on top of it. You let time do its part. The easiest way to destroy financial momentum is to convert every improvement into higher fixed costs. A larger rent payment, a larger car payment, a larger subscription load. More recurring obligations that quietly assume your current income will remain uninterrupted, and your current preferences will never change. I have never liked fixed costs that pretend the future is guaranteed. They narrow flexibility, and flexibility is enormously valuable. Transportation is one of the clearest examples. Many people spend decades pouring an astonishing amount of money into cars. They do not merely buy transportation. They finance identity, convenience, ego, and habit all at once. The monthly payment looks manageable. Insurance joins it, maintenance joins it, fuel joins it. Depreciation does its quiet work in the background. Over time, the total becomes massive. What bothers me is not that people like cars. I understand liking nice things. The issue is that many people evaluate the decision through the lens of monthly affordability instead of lifetime capital destruction. That is a terrible lens. Monthly affordability asks, can I squeeze this into my current cash flow? Capital thinking asks, what is this decision removing from my future compounding base? Those are not the same question. A $30,000 vehicle is not merely $30,000. It is what $30,000 could have become if left working for you. Stretch the horizon long enough and the foregone future can dwarf the pleasure of the purchase. Opportunity cost is one of the most important ideas in all finance because it is the invisible price tag attached to every visible decision. Most people do not feel it. That is why they keep sacrificing compounding for immediate comfort. The first $20,000 helps a person finally feel opportunity cost in a serious way. Once you have struggled to build that amount, once you have watched how slowly the first stage moves, once you have felt the psychological power that comes from simply holding a reserve, you become less willing to trade large pieces of future freedom for temporary status. The old car begins to look different. The smaller apartment begins to look different. The modest vacation begins to look different. You stop translating restraint as punishment and start translating it as purchased optionality. That is a profound shift, and it tends to spread. Housing, hobbies, education choices, recurring bills, everyday lifestyle signals, all of them begin to pass through a better filter. Not a joyless filter, not a misers filter, a strategic filter. What am I really buying? How long will the satisfaction last? What future flexibility am I surrendering? Does this move improve my life enough to justify the capital it removes from my ownership base? You would be amazed how many expenses fail that test once you ask the question. Honestly, this does not mean life must become sterile. It means life becomes intentional. The goal is not to eliminate pleasure. The goal is to stop confusing expense with progress. A great many people are busy purchasing the appearance of advancement while quietly delaying the substance of it. That is one reason. $20,000 matters psychologically. It proves that you can derive satisfaction from a balance sheet improving, not merely from consumption expanding. That is the seed of a very different life. Once you cross that threshold and keep protecting it, the future begins to feel less like a sequence of ambushes and more like something you can shape. The calendar changes. 12 months no longer look like 12 opportunities for something to go wrong. They begin to look like 12 chances to keep compounding your position. That is how wealth really begins. Not with glamour, with momentum. And momentum is precious because it is so difficult to create from a dead stop. I think many young people underestimate how much energy is lost in the first stage. Saving the first meaningful reserve from ordinary wages is hard, because there are no reinforcing returns large enough to motivate you. You are trying to change behavior before the rewards are obvious. You are trying to be patient before patience feels useful. You are trying to trust a machine that has not yet visibly accelerated. That is why the first threshold has moral value as well as financial value. It demonstrates character under conditions where character is not yet receiving much feedback. You behave well before the world pays you for it. Later, the world often does pay you for it. At higher levels of capital, progress can appear almost unfair. That is the whole point of compounding. Once the base grows large enough, returns begin to shoulder more and more of the work. A sum that once required many months of discipline can later appear almost automatically through portfolio growth. People looking only at the later stage call it luck, privilege, secret access, or some unfair game. Sometimes there are unfair advantages in the world, but often what they are seeing is simply an older machine with more flywheel. The flywheel did not always spin that fast. Somebody had to push it when it was heavy. That is what the first $20,000 represents to me. It is the first meaningful turn of the wheel. Not because it is a fortune, because it starts the self-reinforcing loop. Better cushion, better decisions, better opportunities, better confidence, better allocation, higher savings, larger capital base, more compounding, more patience, more freedom. That loop is what people are really trying to build, whether they know it or not, and the opposite loop exists too. No cushion, panic decisions, bad debt, weak negotiating position, lifestyle purchases used as emotional relief. No capital base, no compounding, more dependence, more fear. That loop also compounds. This is why I do not like financial advice that focuses only on income or only on investment selection. Those matter. But behavior under pressure matters just as much. A person can earn decent money and still remain trapped if every raise immediately becomes a new fixed obligation. Another person can earn moderately, build a reserve, protect it, and put himself in position to capitalize when a better opportunity appears. The difference is rarely visible in the beginning. Later, it becomes enormous. There is another point worth remembering. The first reserve does not merely protect you from bad luck. It helps you think more clearly about what you want. Many desires turn out to be stress symptoms. People say they want the larger place, the newer car, the expensive signal, the indulgent reward, the constant spending release. Often what they really want is relief, dignity, calm, and breathing room. Those are not the same purchases. One of the strange gifts of saving a meaningful reserve is that it reveals the distinction. Once the background panic starts to subside, some cravings lose their force. You discover that part of what you were calling taste was actually anxiety. Part of what you were calling self-expression was actually compensation. Part of what you were calling success was actually the hope that a purchase might briefly erase insecurity. A reserve does a better job of erasing insecurity than a flashy object ever will. Objects demand maintenance. Reserves create options. Objects depreciate. Reserves can compound. Objects often lock you into future payments. Reserves widen your escape routes. I know which side of that equation I prefer. Now, none of this means that $20,000 is the final answer. It is only the first answer. If handled well, it becomes the base from which you begin solving bigger problems. How do I raise my earning power? How do I own more productive assets? How do I lower the fragility of my household? How do I keep my burn rate from expanding faster than my capital base? How do I move from protection to compounding? How do I build the kind of flexibility that lets me make one or two very smart long-term decisions instead of 1,000 scared short-term ones? That last point matters enormously. Financial progress often arrives through a handful of important decisions made from strength. Which job to take, which city to live in, whether to go back to school, whether to start a business, when to invest aggressively during pessimism, whether to tie yourself to a house you cannot comfortably carry, whether to keep your costs low enough that freedom remains an option. Those decisions are easier and often wiser when a reserve already exists. That is why I would tell any person starting from zero that the first serious target is not outward wealth. It is inward stability with visible proof attached to it. Build the reserve, get out of constant reaction. Let your mind breathe, then keep going. Do not celebrate by dismantling the base. Do not treat the first solid footing as spare cash. Do not let the culture talk you back into proving things you no longer need to prove. There is no medal for looking rich while staying fragile. There is no wisdom in financing a life that requires perfect conditions to remain upright. There is tremendous power in quiet liquidity. There is tremendous power in a modest life with a rising ownership base. There is tremendous power in waking up and knowing that a mistake, a delay, a negotiation, a transition, or a rough quarter will not break you. That is what the first $20,000 begins to buy. Not luxury, not status, not exemption from all difficulty. It buys the first real taste of financial self-command. And once people experience that, many of them never want to go back. They stop admiring noise. They stop chasing symbols. They stop believing that a bigger payment means a bigger life. They begin to understand that money is most valuable not when it is displayed, but when it quietly changes the range of moves available to you. That understanding can transform an ordinary income into a stronger future. It can transform a scared worker into a patient negotiator. It can transform a nervous spender into an owner. It can transform the way a family experiences uncertainty. It can transform the speed at which compounding begins to matter. So when someone asks me where wealth really starts, I do not begin with a mansion or a million. I begin with the moment a person finally has enough margin to stop living in pure defense. For many people, that moment begins around $20,000. Small enough to sound unimpressive, large enough to change the whole game. And if you treat it correctly, not as permission to consume, but as the first permanent stone in the foundation, it can become the point where money stops controlling your choices and starts serving them. That is when the future begins to widen. That is when patience gets rewarded. That is when compounding stops being a theory and starts becoming a force in your life. That is when you realize the goal was never to look wealthy. It was to become hard to corner. And the first time you become hard to corner financially, even a little, you have crossed into a very different world.